There are a lot of buyers out there who don't know where to start in the process. They don't know what to do, and they're afraid of making mistakes in the buying process. So today, I want to go through some of those common home buyer mistakes, some of the common buyer mistakes that people make when they are starting this process or even before. So the first thing that I see that kind of goes wrong and slides sideways is that buyers start looking before they're pre-approved. And I'm even including open houses in this. It's really a bad idea for buyers to start looking at houses and falling in love before they're actually pre-approved. So the very first thing you want to do is find a good full-time agent and get some recommendations for lenders, for loan officers. And then once you're pre-approved, you can start the process. Otherwise, you could be looking in the wrong price point for you. You need to be more realistic about what it is that's available to you, and you can only do that if you're pre-approved. Another thing that goes right along with that is failing to do a buyer counseling session with a professional real estate agent. When you're a buyer, there are lots of upfront costs that you need to consider, appraisal fees, inspection fees, and you get the full picture if you do that buyer counseling session, if you sit down for an hour or so with your agent and do that so that you know what to expect in the process. You know what's going to happen and when. You get a good idea for the process itself when you do the buyer counseling session. If you don't do that, you're just kind of learning as you go. And that can be uncomfortable for most people. Other things that I've seen that are common mistakes, people get excited and they want to buy a property sight unseen. Never a good idea. Never a good idea. If you want a representative to kind of help you filter through, we still want buyers to be able to see what they're buying. And many sellers will not consider selling to a buyer who hasn't seen their home yet. There's too big of a risk that you'll get in town for inspections and not like the property. So buying sight unseen is bad for buyers and sellers both. Skipping inspections if you're an owner occupant. If you're an investor and you know what you're doing, that's a different story. But skipping inspections just to try to impress is not a great idea. If you have a fairly good idea of the house, you can maybe consider limited inspections, but you definitely want to do inspections on the property, in particular if you're going to be an owner-occupant and live there. When I first started, the market crashed and we had a lot of properties on the market that were in really poor shape. And I always got a good laugh when someone would walk into one of these places and complain about the condition of the carpet. Because to me, when the toilets are falling through the floor, that's a lot more alarming than the color of the carpet. So I see a lot of buyers who weigh the cosmetics and put more weight on the cosmetics. And that's a higher priority for them than the bones or mechanics of the house. And when you're looking at these places, you should have balance, or the property should be priced accordingly for what it needs. But some of my favorite properties just have those great bones, and people have kept up on the mechanics, but maybe not so much the cosmetic updating, which you can do in the future. If you've got structural problems, that's much harder to deal with than changing a paint color or carpet later on down the road. So I see a lot of buyers putting a lot more weight on those cosmetic updates than on the actual roof, windows, mechanics of the house, those important high-ticket items. You want to balance when you're looking. You want to consider what exactly needs to be done with the entire house, not just the cosmetics. I saw one house one time that was beautifully cosmetically updated, but it happened to be sliding down the hillside. That was a problem. So just keep that in mind as well. One of the most heartbreaking mistakes that I see is people settling for something that they really don't want. There was a stretch of time where if you settled for something you didn't want, you could turn around and still sell it and get out from under it and maybe stick a couple of bucks in your pocket. But now is not the time to do that. So now that prices are at historic highs, you don't want to do that. You're going to pay a lot for these places and you don't want to have to turn around and try to sell them. So don't settle for what you don't want. If it's definitely not even in the picture, I don't encourage that. And then most of the time, like my biggest pet peeve, especially in off-market sales, is when a buyer doesn't put an offer in writing quickly. For instance, if you have access to a family property and you just kind of chat about it, but you never put anything in writing, you need to get an offer in writing on that place as soon as possible. Get that under contract and get through the process before someone else comes along and scoops it up or somebody changes their mind. If you have a question about this topic or any other, feel free to reach out to me. by phone, text, email, private message. And if you're watching on YouTube, feel free to subscribe. Thanks. Bye.